Hey guys, welcome to Michelle's STEM Journey. I am Michelle and I'm here today with another AMC Problem of the Week video. This week's video comes from the year 2010, 10A Problem 15, and it deals with logic. I hope you all enjoyed this video and let's get started. States, in a magical swamp, there are two species of talking amphibians, toads, whose statements are always true, and frogs, whose statements are always false. Four amphibians, Brian, Chris, Leroy, and Mike, live together in the swamp, and they make the following statements. Brian says, Mike and I are different species. Chris says, Leroy is a frog. Leroy says, Chris is a frog. Mike says, of the four of us, at least two are toads. How many of these amphibians are frogs? Okay, so starting off, we can already tell that one of Chris and Leroy must be a frog. So basically, we're going to start off with these two. And so we know that one of them is a frog and one of them is a toad because they cannot be both toads or both frogs. Because if you see here, if Chris, let's just assume that Chris is a toad. So scenario 1, Chris is a toad. That means that he's telling the truth. So that means that Leroy is a frog, right? But if Leroy is a frog, that means that it's lying. And so he lies when he says that Chris is a frog. And so that makes sense, because if that's a lie, then that means that Chris is a toad, and that will make sense. But it will not make sense if, for example, both of them are frogs or both of them are toads. So if both of them are toads, then Chris is a toad, it's saying that Leroy is a frog, and it's a toad, so it's telling the truth. But if Leroy is also a toad and it's telling the truth, it would contradict. So we see here that Chris and Leroy, one of them is a frog, one of them is a toad. It doesn't matter which one, because it's only, the question is how many are frogs, so it's asking us for the number, but not exactly which amphibian is what. And then Brian and Mike. So let's just assume that Brian is a toad. We're just gonna assume that for right now. Then if it's a toad, that means that Mike is frog, because it says that Brian says that Mike and I are different species. And if Brian is a toad and is telling the truth, then that means that Mike is a frog. And so Mike says that out of the four of us, at least two are toads. So if it says that at least two are toads and Mike is a frog, then that means that he's lying. And so this would mean that none or one of the amphibians is a toad. And we can know this because we can write it numerically. So if it says that at least two are toads, then if it's telling the truth, then it would mean that in, for example, I'm just going to let that be the variable. So if at least two are toads, then that means that in would be greater than or equal to 2. However, because assuming right now we are assuming that Brian is a toad and Mike is a frog, and so Mike is lying. So that means that he's actually saying that n would be less than 2, because that's the opposite of n is greater than or equal to 2. So that means that n is equal to 0 or 1. So that's where I got the thing about if Mike is a frog and he lies about at least 2 being toads, and that means that none or one of the amphibians is a toad. However, that is absurd because we just assumed that Brian is a toad, and then we also know that it's confirmed that one out of Chris and Leroy is a toad. So that means that we already have 2 toads right here. And so our assumption right here of assuming that Brian is a toad and Mike is a frog, that leads to a contradiction. And so that means that it can only be the other way around. So Brian must be a frog. And if Brian is a frog, then that means that he's lying. So when he says that Mike and I are different species, that means that the truth is that Mike and I are the same species. So that means that Mike is also a frog. And then if Mike is also a frog, then that means that our assumption will be valid because, again, if Mike is lying, then that means that none or one of the amphibians is a toad, which is perfectly valid because Brian is a frog, Mike is a frog, and then one of Chris and Leroy is a frog, leading to the fact that we only have one toad. And so that is valid. So we have one frog, two frog, and then three frogs. So there are three frogs in total. So the answer is D, 3.